When making content about classic World of Warcraft, you quickly learn that people can't help but compare the classic game to the retail version of modern times. In my experience, this behaviour only increases in frequency and the intensity of the reaction when there is either new content released for either version of the game, or more often, when one version of the game is perceived to be failing. This can be difficult to manage here on YouTube. After all, whilst I pull no punches when it comes to sharing my strong personal preference for the earlier versions of WoW, I have no intention of ruining other people's fun or shitting on the retail game as a cheap way to grow my channel. My personal issues with modern WoW are just that, personal, and whilst I stand by my belief that the game has moved in the wrong developmental direction over the years, I don't resent other players for enjoying it, and I would like to one day return to retail and check it out. In short, the last thing I want to do is foster an antagonistic environment through my videos towards modern World of Warcraft. With that being said, I think that the constant comparison of retail and classic is an inevitable consequence of having multiple versions of World of Warcraft available to players, especially considering you can play them all with just one subscription. People are always going to compare their options in these circumstances, and even though, as I've just stated, you can play any available version of WoW, be it Vanilla Era Classic, Hardcore, Wrath Classic or Retail with just one subscription, most people don't have the time, interest or the energy to divide their gaming experience like that. Real life, responsibilities, commitments and other leisure interests get in the way of that, and the need to therefore prioritise, to choose one version of the game over the rest, leads to people picking sides very quickly. Given that my channel has largely become a classic WoW channel, for now at least, I see this debate all the time, typically through the lens of people like myself who prefer classic, by which I mean vanilla era WoW, over what came after. And before I get into the heart of this video, I want to make it clear that I understand that. I understand that my audience is primarily made up of people who prefer classic, especially vanilla WoW with its old Lucius Malfoy looking high elf models and one mechanic boss fights, so I appreciate that a lot of the feedback in this retail v classic debate that I've seen in the last few months is weighted heavily in favour of classic on my channel. But still, I think it's interesting that this debate is even happening in the first place. I mean, is it not amazing that people to this day argue that a nearly 20-year-old version of a game that hasn't seen any new content released since 2006, and which has been officially playable again for 4 years, is a better game than the modern version which has had all that time to refine, innovate and improve? I think so anyway, and I think it's worth asking ourselves why this is. Why is it that people prefer old school WoW over what we have today? And I've been asking myself that question a lot lately as I've levelled my rogue through old Azeroth and interacted with so many other players. And I wanted to make a video about it in the hope that we can perhaps figure out what makes vanilla so appealing to us and possibly apply that to the future of the game. Plus, I really enjoy talking about the themes and mechanics which work together to make old Azeroth such an immersive and enjoyable place to be, so if that's your thing, watch on. I think if you were to ask 100 classic players why they prefer their version of WoW over retail, you'd likely get 100 unique answers, but the central theme would remain consistent, and it's why I prefer classic too. I think I can summarise it in one word in fact: adventure. Let me explain. You see, I think that this all comes down to the developmental direction that Blizzard took WoW in after vanilla, compared to what inspired its original development. Vanilla WoW is at its core an online adventure role-playing game. The focus is on making your own specific character based on the aesthetic and thematic preferences you have in fantasy games, and then being thrust out into a truly massive, vast world with an equal level of depth to explore on your own terms. You feel like a drop of water in an ocean, not just because of how big the world is, but also because of how many intricate systems there are for you to delve into, and the presence of many other players of all levels that you see out in the world. The focus is on creating your own adventure right from the start, and doing it your own way. To put it simply, World of Warcraft has never been a sandbox game, but the magic of vanilla is its ability to appear like a sandbox game, whilst providing a satisfying, clear path of progression for your character. Now, some people will already be saying that these are just words, that I'm just regurgitating the same praise for classic that you've heard from 100 different people for years now, and that in reality vanilla WoW is a dated game packed full of inconvenient mechanics and gameplay elements. And to an extent, I actually agree with that. Vanilla is full of inconveniences, but I personally think that's partly what makes it so good, especially in comparison to the increasingly streamlined, stripped down game which came later. I mean, think about it. Getting your first mount at level 40 only feels so great because you've spent the last 39 levels running around a massive world at a snail's pace. Getting your hands on a sweet weapon halfway through your leveling experience, like the Whirlwind Axe or Vanquisher's Sword, only feels great because of how inconveniently long the time is that it takes for you to level, and your need to constantly increase your power to match the tanky, hard-hitting mobs you're pitted against along the way. Completing a labyrinthine dungeon like Maraudon, Sunken Temple or BRD only feels like such a grand achievement because of the time and effort you need to spend putting a group together, getting to the instance, and then working your way through a huge expanse packed full of mobs, not designed for speed and efficiency, but rather for immersion, exploration, and to fit into the overall world the game brings to life. In short, like any great adventure, vanilla constantly throws inconvenient problems your way and lets you figure out your own solutions, and it does so in a way which feels consistent and authentic to an actual virtual world. There is no cutting corners here, no skipping the queue. When you play the game, you are logging your character into what was designed first and foremost as a world, not a series of game modes tied loosely together in an open environment like a glorified lobby game. This is what MMOs were originally designed to be, virtual worlds for players to quest and explore in, where the systems encouraged player interactions, socialization, and your own agency. Where your desire to run a dungeon or complete a quest or team up with another player wasn't based solely on whether it would result in a cost-effective, measurable increase in your character's power level relative to the time expenditure. This approach to design wasn't just limited to MMORPGs either, but is instead indicative of an older approach to game design overall. For example, if you were to look at another of my favourite games, Morrowind, released a couple of years before WoW, you can see the same approach. The fast travel systems which have become standard in later Elder Scrolls games are heavily limited. Character progression runs at a much slower pace, and there is no ever-present compass guiding you to your next objective. Adventure. That's what it was all about back then. And no, not just because we were kids, or because the internet was so much younger and less saturated with every manner of guide and forum post directing you to play the game the correct way. Instead, vanilla WoW and games like it feel refreshing and immersive for players now because of design choices that still hold up 20 years later. So that's vanilla, and why I think it remains the preferred version of World of Warcraft for a good bunch of players. But what about retail? What makes it so different from the WoW of yesterday? And why did the retail game start to decline, at least in terms of player count, after the end of the classic trilogy? Well, to me, it comes back to that earlier point about inconvenience. You see, I made a case for why the inconveniences of vanilla are actually part of what makes the game great, at least most of the time. But sometimes, they're not. Sometimes inconvenience is just a pain, and the degree to which you can tolerate it in your leisure activities will obviously vary from person to person. Sometimes having to travel all the way from Stormwind to Desolace, or from Orgrimmar to Blackrock Mountain, is just a pain in the arse, especially if you get ganked on the boat from Booty Bay. Vanilla requires a certain tolerance, dare I say it, even an appreciation for pain that some people quite understandably don't share. And unlike today, where we have the ability to compare vanilla to the modern game and assess their differences with the benefit of hindsight, back when it was current content and Blizzard was eagerly trying to draw in more and more new players, these issues were seen less as an essential component of creating an immersive virtual fantasy world, and more as flaws which ideally should be ironed out as WoW progressed through its expansions. And that's what happened from as early as the Burning Crusade. I remember watching Preach's Legacy of TBC video back in the day, and hearing him justifiably celebrate the practical advantages of quest hubs, which became commonplace in Outland compared to the disparate, scattered nature of questing in vanilla, which would often see you jump from zone to zone, completing a quest or two at a time before hitting a temporary barrier and needing to move on. If you look at a vanilla dungeon like Zul'Farrak and realise how scattered the dungeon quests are, and then compare it to, say, Hellfire Ramparts in the Burning Crusade, where the quests are close by, you can understand why this was considered a big improvement, in terms of practicality at least. And TBC was just the start. Wrath of the Lich King was the expansion that really began the process of trying to solve the perceived problems of World of Warcraft. Interacting with players to form dungeon groups is tedious and time consuming? Add in LFD. Leveling is slow and annoying for most players? Add in heirlooms to speed it up. And so it went on and on. With each new expansion, the process of solving WoW's problems continued, and ironically, the player base eventually began to shrink at the same time. And so we have the game of today, a game stripped of as many inconvenient elements as possible, a game in which you can log in on a character and without moving queue for literally any kind of content worth doing. And speaking of what's worth doing, the game will tell you that too, directing you down one of a few paths which, due to the obsolescence of treating Azeroth like a virtual world to explore and adventure in, have become the objective ways to correctly play the game. And all of this can of course be accomplished from the comfort of your home city without the irritation of having to interact in any way with other players. I mean, why would you want to talk to people in a massively multiplayer game, right? Don't worry about it, you'll not need to speak to anyone unless you choose to say, try Mythic Plus or harder difficulties of raiding. But again, why would you bother to go that far as a new player if you can experience every instance the game has to offer through LFD or LFR? I could go on and the salt would continue to flow until it piled up in dunes like the fucking Sahara Desert. It's simple really. Blizzard succeeded in their goal of solving WoW, as I put it. They cut out time-consuming, tedious elements, they streamlined the game, they increased their focus on end-game content and made this easier to pick up and play. They made the game quicker and much more efficient, and in doing so, they lost its magic, at least to players like me. In return for what was thought to be a better user experience, they traded a lot of its depth, its immersion, and its ability to grip a player from level 1 and not let go. The unparalleled, historic achievement of vanilla WoW was that Blizzard succeeded in crafting an experience that went beyond the ordinary feeling of playing a video game. They made the World of Warcraft a world, vast and seamless, rich in lore that wasn't thrust in your face or course-corrected at every turn. They made a place worthy of a true adventure. And then, over the course of many years, and often endorsed by the complaints and requests of players, they proceeded to gamify, for lack of a better word, every aspect of the world that they had so skillfully and lovingly created. Now, as I'm sure you can tell, it is very difficult for me to not let my biases show when it comes to vanilla. I know there is an equal or even greater portion of the World of Warcraft player base who view most, if not all, the changes made after vanilla with a more positive light than I do. Honestly, there are times when I agree with this, and there are many aspects of modern WoW which I miss as a classic player, such as the more competitive, fast-paced raids and dungeons, which I took so much joy in for many years. The game, in many ways, isn't so much better or worse, depending on which version you play, it's often just different. But like I said at the start of this video, most people don't have time to split equally between the different versions of WoW, and that means that the choice about what you prefer your game to be does need to be made on some level. The life and history of World of Warcraft often feels to me a little bit like a train journey. Each expansion is a different stop, and players choose which stop to get off at depending on their own preferences and what they would like to see. Some people are content to ride that train all the way till its final destination, wherever that might be, but some of us were happiest right back at the start. What I'm trying to say here is that everyone has their own idea of when WoW was at its best, when the blend of modernisation and old school immersion was at its finest. For some it's Wrath or TBC, for others it's MoP or even Legion. But for me and many other players, World of Warcraft's design philosophy, the intentions of its developers, were never better than in vanilla, in the original world that they designed for us to explore and adventure through. And now, almost 20 years later, that remains the case, and it's why to this day, despite its age, despite its inconveniences, and regardless of the lack of new content for it, so many of us look to vanilla era WoW with fondness, and we're always ready to jump back in.
And I want to talk about ice cream. Ice cream is great. Ice cream is one of my favorite desserts. Personally, I love chocolate, and I love cookies and cream. Cookies and cream is actually my all-time favorite dessert. But I understand that for some of you, your favorite flavor is vanilla.
Hey everyone, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video and maybe you even agreed with me on this, who knows. When playing old school WoW, I often find myself thinking about what makes it so great to me and how the game has changed, and these thoughts always ultimately find their way into one of my videos. If you like this sort of content and you'd like to see more, please consider subscribing to the channel, it really does mean a lot to me. Alongside my current fresh playthrough of Classic Era WoW on my Rogue, I have plans to cover some of my favourite events, quests and lore in the game, so if that sounds like your thing, you might want to stick around. I've also just moved house, by the way, which explains the pause in the video uploads, but this means that very soon I should be able to finally start streaming, which is something that I'm really looking forward to, and I hope that you stick around for that as well. But until the next episode guys, be well, take care of yourselves, and I shall see you in the next video. Bye bye!